What is happening, you beautiful bastards? Welcome back to another week. This week, we talk about politics. Now, before you go running away scared, know that I hate politicians and I think they should all die.
Ooh,
Jerry
wow.
is somewhere else.
I'm not quite that far on the spectrum. I'm not a fan of politics, but killing them all, not all of them. Some of them for sure, but not all.
Maybe they shouldn't die. Just go on an island somewhere and don't talk to anyone for the rest of their lives.
But yeah, we do have a guest to do that talking with us. And he also, I don't believe, wants everyone to be dead like Grizz does.
No, but he does take the side that I would say is less popular right now.
Yeah, I'd say you're probably right, but he's not extreme. So a little bit about our guest. His name is Josh Lewis, and he is a conservative. Now, some of you may find that problematic, but he lives down in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and he works for the Oklahoma State Auditor's Office. And he was actually a former candidate for the city auditor because he's got over a decade of experience with auditing governments. It's a pretty good fit, if you ask me. But we kind of go into detail on the hardcore conservatives, the ones you see on the news, Trumpers, like the real Trumpers that, you see in the news.
Drinking the Kool-Aid.
It's a crazy time. QAnon believers, the ones that really went off the deep end after Trump's presidency. Now, I know there's a lot of liberals or Democrats or people just on that side of the spectrum who really hate everybody on the other side. But we're of a different mindset around here. We kind of think that differing opinions are pretty good for this country, but maybe not as different as they are right now. What do you think, Chris?
I just think right now everything's pretty polarized, right? And it doesn't have to be politics. It could be anything. I mean, I saw something earlier that was just polarized about when you take a shower. And it's right now it's just my way or the highway. There's no room to see the other side's opinion. Which to me right now, you should always be listening and have a conversation. Like, I don't know. I was always raised to hear them out and have a conversation. Maybe I'm fucked up in my thinking. And how am I going to figure that out if I'm sitting around people who always tell me I'm right?
Well, I don't disagree with you. Even if you are a liberal and you're talking to a conservative, whatever label you give yourself, and you're talking to the other side, typically what we see now is if they find that someone disagrees, they have a meltdown and start calling each other names. Well, for one, that's not how you communicate with another human being. But two, if you truly believe that you're right and they're wrong, you're going to have a hard time convincing somebody that you're right if you don't know why they think they're right.
You mean I can't just have a toddler temper tantrum and fucking storm out of the room screaming?
You can, but then what you get what we have right here.
What is happening, you beautiful bastards?
Speaking of being called names, you are a conservative, right? So how do you feel about being a conservative in the current political climate? Like an open conservative saying it out loud, because that seems problematic.
It's dangerous nowadays.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it is. It depends on the context. It depends on who I'm talking to. Sometimes I have to be a little careful to try to assess what this individual may hear when I say that. But I do use the word conservative. I would like to think that I've spent enough time researching and studying this for myself that I have a better working understanding than what is typically kind of thrown around. And I'm happy to defend those positions. But yeah, I'm well aware of the fact that sometimes if I say the word conservative, it's going to conjure all kinds of images that I did not intend.
We were talking about this. I was at a Christmas party, 2 weeks ago now, and someone brought up that they were conservative, and someone who's on the other side of the spectrum immediately exploded. And it's like, wait a minute, why are they not allowed to have an opinion? We don't need to go 0 to 100 here. Whether you agree with them, disagree with them, or whatever, at least hear them out, let them happen.
Yeah.
So
but that's the world we're in.
Speaking of the world we're in, as a conservative, I mean, when I was 18, I actually registered Republican, and I'm still a registered Republican. But I think I'm personally a little hard pressed to call myself a conservative, but I can't really place myself accurately anywhere else. So that's kind of where I sit. I'm curious to see what your opinion is on, I guess, Grizz, what do we call them? Trumpers?
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be the name going around.
Now, I don't want to confuse that with people who voted for Trump, because just because you voted for Trump does not make you a Trumper. Just means that you didn't want to vote for the other side. Actually, before we get there, are you a Trumper?
No. By probably any definition you could cobble together, I'm not a Trumper, unless you simply mean I didn't vote for the Democratic candidate.
Right.
But that's kind of my thing with right now, especially with, I mean, this past year, the Republican Party has been divided a lot in my mind. I lean to the right, as does Jerry, but before this, we seemed to kind of be one party, and you had little factions within that, right? And then all of a sudden, January 6th happens, and you have part of the Republican Party going off the deep end, and the rest of us going, "What the fuck just happened?" Like, what? And then on top of that, there seem to be doubling down on things. You're sitting there like, wait, it's almost like a state of confusion for the rest of us. It just every day is something new.
Yeah, no, and there's and unfortunately there's, I guess you could say, almost a third group in there, which is a much smaller group, obviously, but the real gatekeepers in media and in politics and higher office. I've heard it said that a lot of those individuals, at least if they had those positions held years ago, prior to, say, the Trump phenomenon, you would almost be hard pressed to find them in close quarters if they were being honest with you that they actually bought into, say, the election was stolen or, the big lies, they say it. But they play the part in their public face. And so that's almost a third group, not the true believers, but an unwillingness or a cowardliness about just telling the truth.
Yeah, they're riding the coattails.
Yeah.
This seems to be the popular thing, so I'm going to roll with this, but just on the outskirts, so maybe I can survive when whatever blows up. Or I can ride this into the sunset.
Yeah, I actually... We had an episode that we recorded earlier in the week where it was just Grizz and I, and we were talking about the issues with this incredible, I guess we'll call it extremism, that's actually happening on both sides. So Grizz and I tend to get lumped up with like centrists, even though we're really not. I separate the issues based on how I view them. Like, for example, I'm pro-abortion, but also pro-gun, which doesn't really mesh when you view them both that way on either side, you know what I mean? And so we're kind of, I don't know. Me in particular, I'm a little isolated from both sides on occasion,
We're abominations.
Yeah.
And I think that's most of the public, though. You know what I mean? So if you have, if you want to split it up into good numbers, you have an even split 33%, 33%, 33%, right? And you have 33% in the middle who are sitting there and they're just kind of bouncing back and forth, and they're sitting there going, all right, I agree with this one for right now, or I'm going back the other way, and just which way we're swaying. And if you go back to Trump before the pandemic, he might have gotten another term. With what he was doing, like, it wasn't completely awful. He was driving Democrats batshit crazy, but was it really was it that bad what he was doing? Some of the shit was like, okay, I don't know where we're going here. But now, once the pandemic hit, it was all over. Like, I don't see there was a really good chance of him getting back in. And now even afterwards, you're hearing more. He's keeping on trying, and it just seems to be withering out. I'm curious who the candidate will be for 2024. If it is going to be him, that'll be interesting.
Aren't we all? Yeah, that's the $1 million question, is who is running? And if he did run, does that mean he would run unopposed in the Republican Party? Or would there then be those who would stand up? And maybe I shouldn't say stand up, but at least say that, well, even if they said, hey, I was supportive of Donald Trump and I voted for the guy and I support him, but I think there's a better way we could do this.
I think if he ran unopposed, I would be blown away. Like, they have to have someone going against them. It just wouldn't make any sense,
I mean, the irony is if he does run for 2024, he would have to concede the fact he didn't actually win the election in 2020 under constitutional grounds. But
yeah, that's true. We should bring that up there with the signs. If you're saying 2024, man, that means you didn't get 2020 because you wouldn't be able to be reelected.
So, the reason I brought up Trump is because when you hear the word conservative now, especially in the media, because that's really what shapes public opinion, is what they see in the media and now on social media. When most people hear the word conservative, they immediately think that that person is a Trumper, and it vilifies a huge percentage of the population that I think it's not really deserving. And I was wondering if maybe you could break down what being a conservative really means when you're not, when your conservative flavor is not QAnon, that sort of thing,
Yeah, and I would also like to parse that even further, because I think there's even complexities within, say, the Trump movement. Most of my family voted for Donald Trump. Some of them are a little kooky, but most of them are not. They're decent, hardworking, wonderful individuals. And so I think there is an element in which you could, say, be a Trump supporter without being a QAnon dirtbag that stormed the Capitol on January 6th, say.
Oh, absolutely.
So there's a lot of complexity there. But in answer to your question directly, I think conservatism is something that it's an impulse within American society specifically that has existed since time immemorial, or since we've been a nation. It hasn't really, until the modern era, being around the 1950s, really used that as its name, at least in the way we understand it today. And there were a lot of movers and shakers in the movement, such as William F. Buckley is one of those touted often, who he, along with many other godfathers, Russell Kirk, Frank Meyer, many other, kind of developed these theories as what do we actually mean by conservatism. Now, prior to, say, the 1950s, it was all very cerebral because conservatives didn't hold any much power at the time. So it was more theory, and it gets a little bit grubbier when you start electing people to office. But I think there is I consider myself to be a Russell Kirk or Kirkian conservative, among other variants. And one of the things he taught very strongly is that conservatism is non-ideological by nature. It's not programmatic. It's not systemic. In other words, it doesn't have a one-size-fits-all solution to all of our problems. What it means to be a conservative in the United States today is very different than what it would have meant in the Ottoman Empire in the 14th century, say. It's unique to our culture and our heritage. And so, as the name implies, what conservatism means is that we're trying to conserve something, specifically some of the ideas birthed by the founding era. And those have evolved and changed over time. It doesn't mean that we're just stuck in stone. We're just always trying to go back to 1776, but that there's sort of a recognition that hey, here a new nation was birthed, and even maybe there were even prior values. Where did those values come from? How do we bring these things to the forefront? And that isn't programmatic in nature. It's not something that we can just say, therefore, the solution is always to cut taxes, right? We can't come up with just these straight policy solutions. But it is a conservative spirit. It's an idea of gratitude, an idea that we've inherited good things and that we need to be proud of, and we need to conserve or preserve those things.
I mean, I can fully understand that aspect. And like I said, I lean to the right anyways. I think in politics in general nowadays, it's so, everything, like Jerry said before, everything's just radicalized and everything's torn apart. And I mean, to me, the media plays such a massive part in all this, where it's just dividing everyone more and more and more. And how much of it is even truthful that you're hearing about it on either side? And I don't know. I don't see that. I mean, to me, elections are going to get worse and worse and worse and worse. I don't see them getting better.
Unfortunately, or at least worse in the sense that I don't see one of the two major parties decisively winning elections in the near term. Maybe that could happen. January 6th probably never would have happened as, say, Trump had lost the state of Texas when he ran for president. It was such a decisive defeat, or victory for that matter, if he had decisively won. But yeah, we are kind of locked into this. And what's on the one hand kind of ironic about it is our rhetoric doesn't really match our policy and our politics. We act as if our country is in one breath away of being controlled by communist or fascist.
Yeah.
In reality, our policies of both, Joe Biden in terms of how much money he's spending is a little insane. But it's not quite as radical of either the Biden or the Trump administration or even previous administrations as of being a step or two away from socialism or sort of a Handmaid's Tale type Norman Rockwell America, we're all mandated to behave in a certain Norman Rockwell type setting. I'm not saying that there aren't nuances and differences and that they aren't important, but I'm suggesting that we feel as if there's more extremity to our political dialogue than what seems to actually exist if you examine the policies.
Well, yeah, it's almost like they're fishing. They're putting something out there for people to focus on or attack. And as Jerry's put away multiple times before, is it's just something that divides people, right? So whether it's abortion or guns, or if they want it to be the wall or whatever it is, they put that out there. That's what they're going to attack while they just keep running daily business on the side.
Yeah. Now, as I mentioned before, I was, I kind of consider myself conservative, at least Republican anyway. I don't think I could vote for Trump again. I did vote for him the first time. I didn't vote the second time because it was pretty divisive for me. Like his declining behavior in office was problematic for me anyway. Now, as a more educated conservative like yourself, how did you view Trump when he started versus where we ended with January 6th?
One of the craziest, wildest rides we've had in the nation from, from just the standpoint of the executive. I mean, I think, whether you love or hate the guy, I think we can all agree he was the most unique president we've had in a lot of measurements. There were some interesting ways in which I was specifically concerned as a conservative that Trump would run more to the left than what he actually did when he became president. Now, I don't, I think one of the things that's a little problematic in our political thinking is we have this sort of left-right divide as if it's a sliding scale. I think it's way more complex than that. So I don't mean that in absence of running to the left, he became ultra-conservative. But he didn't embrace sort of a left agenda that the pre-presidential Donald Trump would have suggested he might have. The two things I've often said that he's been consistent with his entire life are trade policy and immigration. Beyond that, the guy honestly was sort of an empty suit up for grabs, whatever ideology he could attach to himself. So it was more of a cult of personality than any consistent, here are my policies I've developed over many years. That being said, you mentioned January the 6th, but honestly, we almost had a January the 6th type set up in 2016, as you'll recall. During the debates, he literally told the moderator, I will keep you in suspense. I am not going to tell you up front that I will concede the election if the media says I've lost. I'm going to keep you guys in suspense. He told us the same thing a year in advance of the 2020 race. We can't trust we can't trust these machines. All these states are doing all these things. He sets us up for this. So that was, and this is one of my frustrations sometimes is with those who rightly would recognize on January the 6th, his behavior was disgusting, to put it mildly. That's who Donald Trump always was. Someone perfectly willing to undermine our entire democratic order in order to stay in power. Now, thank God he was never some of the worst caricatures of the left depicted him as like a Putin 2.0 or a Hitler. And I don't mean this to be just negative on the guy, but he never had the energy or the political creativity to truly be a sort of authoritarian. Maybe he had some leanings in that direction, but I think the guy just didn't. He was just having fun.
That's the thing nowadays. I mean, you look even back at what was it? I think it was 2020 when all of a sudden everyone's like, oh, World War III is happening. We're not even fucking close to World War III. But it's like automatically we're going 0 to 100. And with everything we talk about. And exactly what you were saying, they're comparing them on both sides. You're hearing comparisons to Nazi Germany. It's like, people, calm the fuck down. We are not even close to Nazi Germany. Like, simmer down. It just blows my mind. We're knee-jerk reactions. I don't know if it's for likes or views, clicks, whatever. I don't know. It's blowing my mind.
It's unhealthy, and I think we all recognize this, that everything has to be a crisis to be addressed. Nothing can simply be a problem and, hey, we ought to work on that. Climate change is going to kill us all. So we have to have the most radical approaches to this, or immigration is going to overrun the country. Now, as a conservative, I may be more open to, say, climate change being a serious issue that we need to deal with. Immigration, I certainly think, is a serious issue. But when everything is a crisis, you become emotionally exhausted, and everything melds together, and you don't, as I've heard it said, think of the last time you were really angry. Did you actually make good decisions in those moments?
Oh, fuck no. No one does. I have to yell at well, I don't yell. I have to talk to my son about this all the time because he's 12. He's at that point where you just start getting angry for no reason because you've got testosterone flowing through. And it's like, hey, you don't make good decisions when you're angry. Don't make decisions when you're angry. Calm down.
Yeah, and we have I think that a lot of this has to do with the sensationalization that Grizz just mentioned with between how the media represents things, various other things. But I don't really know when it actually started to happen, because it seemed kind of gradual that people got so divided. And now we have, when I watch the news, I see either extreme conservatism or extreme liberalism. But in my daily life, most people I know are somewhere in the middle with a lot more common sense than I can see on TV. What do you think when you look at that? What's your take on how we got here?
Yeah, and I'm introduced, and rightly so, as a conservative guest. I think if someone were to examine my politics, they would be decidedly not in the middle. They'd be very far to the right. But I'm also very deeply concerned about the divisiveness of our language and our inability to say, hey, if the other side wins, maybe that's not the end of the United States. Maybe it's bad, but maybe we could keep going, just take a chill pill. How, in terms of, I mean, people far smarter than I have been asking this question: how do we get here? How did, what started it? Just from the political lens, there has been a severe ratcheting up ever in the it's kind of ironic. Some of the heroes of the conservative movement were in some degree responsible for some of the divisiveness. William F. Buckley and Gore Vidal in the 1964, I believe it was the 70 presidential race. I don't remember off the top of my head, but Barry Goldwater running. He was a very divisive figure. But part of the divisiveness was, for the first time, the liberal order had an actual opposition. There were liberal Republicans and there were liberal Democrats, and there were some nuanced differences between them, but for the most part, our nation was in agreement. And that's why I want to be careful here that divisiveness is not good, but it's not always bad, or complete unity is not necessarily always good too. We had a lot of unity, we had a lot of segregation. We had a lot of cultural attitudes that we today recognize as being very unhealthy and very wrong. Some of that, it took some disunion, if you will, to get us there. But in terms of, and Jerry, I'm afraid I'm kind of far afield from your original question. What was it about?
That's okay. Yeah, I was just
wondering how we got this separated, this divisive.
Yeah, how far off track we are now versus where we were, let's say, 1998. 99, because that's my favorite year, as we've discovered.
Help me.
Well, it's definitely gotten worse, and I say this often. I don't think that is a partisan view. I think you will find people on both the left and the right down the middle who all say, yeah, it's gotten worse. Some people point to things like social media. There's a brilliant conservative thinker, Yuval Levin, that often talks about part of what we're experiencing is our institutions, by which he means the things we do together that have forms to them: family, church, state, those things that we do together to kind of define us. We're seeing more and more that they're used for platforms for displaying ourselves, rather than for the sort of things that form us as individuals and that we use for a common purpose to get good things done. In that world, all you can do is be divisive. All a congressman can do is say, I'm representing my constituents by telling everybody how pissed off I am, just like all the rest of them, rather than rolling your sleeves up saying, I guess I got to work with the other side and we got to get something done here. Let's try to move the ball forward somewhat. So I guess I'm trying to express there's a multifaceted to.
Oh, absolutely.
It has clearly gotten worse over the last, say, 20 years, but honestly, it had gotten worse over the past 100 years. To a certain degree, if you go back far enough, we had fought we're talking about Nazis earlier. We had fought a war with the Nazis. I used to grow up listening to these old time radio programs, and Democrats and Republicans would poke fun at each other, and there were nuanced differences, but there was a sense of, we're America, by golly, we're the good guys. And then we had 3 major broadcasting networks. Everybody watched the same news. We all kind of got the same information. Again, that's not always good. A lot of bad can happen if we're just all on the same page. But we're not in that world anymore. Yeah. Every single one of us can choose to be in our own silos and get our own information. And while some of that can be good because it allows for nuance, we obviously have not yet learned how to navigate this in a way that we would recognize as healthy.
Absolutely. I was going to say part of it, I think, is that I think there's a couple different portions in my head. I think, you haven't had anything that really brought America together for 20 years, right? You had 9/11 happened and America came together, right? We were one again. And then since then, 20 years later, we're slowly parting away to where we don't have something unionizing all as one. The other thing I think is cable networks is starting to play into this. Cable's been dying off for years, right? The one thing keeping them alive is sports, and they're starting to lose sports. And so now the one thing they have is putting out absolute crazy bullshit like clickbait. And so it's life support for them. I mean, in 5 years, it would not shock me to find out that they were dead, right? It just, right now they're just doing whatever they can to survive, and it's not helping the US at all. It's just dividing everything.
Yeah, and there are obviously generational differences. You know, younger Americans are less likely to say get their information from cable news. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I'd agree with you. It's I don't know if in 5 years say it would die off, but it's certainly likely to have less of an impact in our life. However, what appears to be replacing it doesn't appear to be an improvement on
no, I'm not saying it is.
Yeah,
I think it in general, what's replacing it is just as bad because it's just going for the clickbaity stuff as well.
Yeah, when the internet was kind of in its infancy, I remember I was pretty young at the time, but I remember, you know, when I'd watch the news, there was a lot of really high hopes, you know, for what the potential was with the internet. And it seems to have, reached that peak of being really good. And now we're on the downward slide where things are literally coming apart at the seams. It's an interesting thing to watch in real time, especially as I would say senior millennials. Josh, how old are you?
39. I'm a geriatric millennial.
All right. So you're right up there with Grizz. He's right behind you. But I'm 33. And just between the three of us, we've kind of watched it go from that original dynamic, which lasted since really World War II, where you had like a mainstream form of news that everybody watched, whether you were conservative or liberal, to where we are now. You can get so much information from so many different places that you really end up going down a path where you're in all these echo chambers that everyone gets stuck in, especially if you're on social media. That I think is a big concern, especially when I talk to liberals, because I don't really talk that much to conservatives. I'm not entirely sure why, but maybe because liberals are louder.
Because you live in New England.
That's true too. But the liberals tend to repeat a lot of the ideologies that typical liberal media has, but most of them can't really go any deeper than the surface with that. You know, things like universal healthcare, which on its face I agree with, but when you try to get deeper than that with, I don't know, we'll call them like your standard liberal, they don't really have anything other than emotion to back it up. Now, I don't know what your experience has been. Do you take a deep dive into the other side to see where their mind is at?
Well, I do as part of, I guess, what you might say the due diligence of my Saving Elephants project, that it helps. And I think you would probably find progressives who, if they took their views serious, would say the same, that learning about the other side or other sides helps you better understand yourself, and it sharpens your own arguments. Yes, what you're describing is not a liberal problem, it's a human problem. And part of it is just because, I mean, let's be frank, most of us don't have time to read. You know, most of us are not nuts like me that actually pay attention to this stuff that much.
Yeah.
And better things. And that's fine. That's wonderful. How terrible would our world be if everybody was on Twitter screaming at each other? You know, and so
wait, that's not what they're doing on Twitter.
It's just the famous people. Normal people aren't doing that yet.
No, Twitter's a tiny tiny but very influential microcosm of representing the, you know, it's not really representative of the larger population, but it is representative, say, the elites and the movers and shakers. But I don't necessarily look for that to change anytime soon. Now, to a certain degree, we're gifted with living in a democratic republic, a wonderful nation. This only works if we're a self-governing people. So there has to be a certain level of, say, civic involvement or at least awareness. But I don't think the solution is to turn everyone into policy experts. It's rather to turn individuals to develop a character in which they recognize what issues are worth me getting worked up over, and who do I trust, and how do I develop a sort of character that's not interested in, say, clickbait, but is actually interested in when it's appropriate and when I have time learning more about these things. And this is really scary, and sometimes it kind of rubs against the grain of what we think is right. Sometimes you just leave an issue alone. Maybe you don't know enough about universal health care, I'm sorry to say it, to even have an opinion. Maybe you don't need to venture into those territories. And maybe there's other areas where you could.
Yeah, I actually like that assessment, because oftentimes, as I said, that when I try to get more information out of people, they don't have any. And I myself, and Grizz actually has said this in the past as well, when someone asks us something, like our opinion on things like universal health care, if I didn't know about it, I would say, I don't really know. I don't know. What do you know about it? That's pretty much the extent of what that conversation would be for me. But you kind of piqued my interest here for a second there when you were talking about this movement that you were doing. These was it Save the Elephant? Is that what you said?
Saving Elephants, yes.
Okay. What is that?
Well, that's the name of my podcast, and prior to that, it was the blog, and it was really born out of, not exclusive to, but born out of the Trump movement. That we were all sort of, I think most Americans were sort of taken aback in 2016, like, what the heck just happened? And to me, it was startling how many individuals in my life who I thought, while we weren't in complete agreement on a good many things, were in more agreement than we actually were. When 2016 happened, it's like, why do we see these things just so totally different? And so Saving Elephants is really born out of it. It's two ideas combined. One being, I am a conservative, and I do strongly believe that conservatism is a necessary approach for any thriving culture or civilization. Ironically, I think there's a certain form of progressivism which we try to change or make things better that's also necessary too. But I think conservatism is very damaged, and it's very in need of repair. And I think for younger Americans such as us, the millennial generation and the Gen Z coming up after us, this is needful to rebirth a healthy, classic sense of conservatism. And the second piece to that, where the Saving Elephants comes in, and this is unfortunate, but we're stuck with, for the time being, two major political parties. And in all likelihood, the Republican Party is the best vehicle for implementing, at least at a policy level, conservative values. I don't see that change anytime soon. Maybe a third party will come by sometime. Heck, maybe out of some miracle, the Democratic Party will begin instituting some conservative policies. But in the meanwhile, it's sort of in absence of another outlet, I still think it's worth trying to revitalize a conservative movement within the Republican Party.
Now, on that note, do you think that current congressional Republicans are a good representation of a healthy conservative in America?
No.
Okay.
No, and there's 435 members of the United States Congress, House and Senate. So there are some wonderful leaders in the House and Senate, Republicans and Democrats, men and women. But no, the majority of, I will say, at the very least, I will say the leadership within both parties not only don't represent, say, conservatism well, I would go so far as to say they are not individuals of integrity, and they don't even represent good governance. There could be, in theory, a progressive individual who I might strongly disagree with their policies, but I still recognize they're behaving in ways that are conducive to good government and just decent character. And I think that's really absent. And it's unfortunate in that Donald Trump happened to the Republican Party. It would be an interesting, alternative history. Had there been a Trumpy type candidate, say, on the Democratic Party, I think we'd be seeing a lot of the same thing coming from the left. So I don't think this is just a Republican problem. I think we're suffering from leadership across the entire nation.
Right.
Yeah, I can agree with that.
Yeah, when one of my brothers is actually very, I guess we'll call him liberal. I wouldn't say he's flaming. He actually disagrees with a lot of liberals. The extreme liberals, he recognizes their issues. But one thing that I got out of him by talking to him, and because we're brothers, he can be a little more open with me in terms of how we think differently on these topics. From what I get out of these conversations, when his side thinks about people like you, they immediately go to people like Mitch McConnell. Now, Mitch McConnell's not really human. I don't know what he is, but
Turtle,
it's really unfortunate that a huge amount of the population in the United States is viewed to be basically Mitch McConnell's, just his minions running everywhere.
Imagine if we turned it into Baker from Massachusetts.
Oh yeah, I don't know a whole lot about him, but I've seen.
Well, he's a Republican that won Massachusetts, so that tells you something.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're in a weird time where, a Republican can win Massachusetts, and Gavin Newsom, who's incredibly liberal, can be. People are attempting to vote him back out. It's a weird time.
We are in a weird time. I think the Republican Party needs some youth, if anything.
It's both parties.
It's true, but what's the average age right now? Like 102?
Yeah, and this predates Trump. I mean, Republican Party has always had a struggle attracting the youth. Well, maybe I shouldn't say always. For my lifetime, has had a struggle attracting the youth. There was a lot of sense in which the Republican Party wasn't the cool party in a lot of ways, and they were a bit. I mean, honestly, I used to joke back when I was more involved in the party itself that I could show up and decrease the median age by 20 years just by showing up to some meeting.
It's true.
And I don't know necessarily the solution there, because I think there is sometimes a sense in which the youth are, I'm trying to think of how to even phrase this. I think there's a healthy way to capture the youth and an unhealthy way at times.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think there's a sense in which we try to appeal to our dark night. We're multifaceted. Millennials, for instance, in some regards are left of center, in some regards are right. We're the first generation, I think, in which we decrease debt for many generations. Part of that was, the Great Recession. We're more debt conscious than say our ancestors. I think we're also less reticent, say, to go to war. Now that could be progressive or conservative, depending on kind of what specific issues we're talking about. There are ways in which we're more pro-life, more pro-gun. We're also more pro-homosexual than our older generations. So we're a bit of a mixed bag. And so there's a different way of appealing to, say, these different variants. Not only that, but we're not all the same. What it means to be a Trumpy, red state young millennial American is radically different than what it means to be part of the Bernie bro crowd, right? These are very different individuals. But I think both parties have always had issues appealing to the youth, partially because, and I don't think this is, I'll go ahead and say it's somewhat unique to millennials and maybe younger Americans. I think we're more strongly adverse to inauthenticity than our older counterparts, that we hate it even more. I think that's part of what appealed about, say, Bernie Sanders, is whether or not you're a socialist, this guy, hey, he was authentic. Like, he actually believes it. He's not just the next. And I often say this, what's weird, Bernie Sanders and Ron Paul, from the extreme right and the extreme left, electrified the youth when each of them collectively ran for president. These old, wrinkly, crockety Caucasian males. It wasn't, it wasn't your Pete Buttigieg. It wasn't, your young, flashy individual that can relate to the kids these days. It was these old guys. But what was different was they were different than everyone else. They were not part of this same mainstream. Now, I'm not pro Ron Paul and I'm not pro Bernie Sanders, but I think millennials, we have this sense of we're sick of hearing the same lies year after year. Give us authenticity. Give us something that's real.
Absolutely.
I think I've, again, been followed or filled with the question. My apologies. I got on a soapbox there.
That's fine. I mean, Bernie Sanders, I never really thought of voting for him, but when I heard him on, he went on, I think it was Rogan, right? And he actually explained why he wanted to do whatever he wants to do. I mean, it makes complete sense. The problem is, how are you going to do it, right? Like, everything you want to do sounds lovely, but in the end, you have to, where's the money coming from in Bernie's excuse,
Yeah, we brought that up a couple of times here. I don't on its face disagree with a lot of liberal policies. I also want people to do better in life. But one thing that keeps coming up is it has to come from somewhere. So if you were in charge as a conservative, Josh, when you have Gen Z coming up and they have all these major issues that they really hone in on, things like healthcare, college debt, things like that. you're not an 80-year-old Republican man. So what do you think is a better way to attract youth to, I don't know, maybe more conservative ideologies to get what they're looking for?
I think some of this, and I'm speaking as a conservative, is a little counterintuitive at first.
Mm-hmm.
I think, speaking of that authenticity, I think some of it starts with tempering expectations. Stop speaking to individuals as if we can solve all of our problems through policy. That there is a level in which we are going to have to revitalize communities and individual. I don't want to just say responsibility, because I think sometimes that card can be overused on the right, though that is a part of it. That some of these solutions are not ever going to be top down, and they would only make things worse. That doesn't mean we can't have the conversations, but it does mean I think if we were to speak in a more tempered expectation of, hey, here is what government can do, here's what it can do well, here's what I'm advocating. And there's going to be a lot of nuance in there. Gen Z specifically, you're right. College debt and climate change are two areas where even Republican and even conservative Gen Zs are way more willing to have some sort of federal approach to this stuff. There's room for nuance and policy discussion in there. But it was a joke when Obama ran for president that to paraphrase him, that the planet was going to heal and the ocean tides would recede. He kind of said the silent part out loud, but in effect, I mean, Donald Trump straight up said, we're going to win so much, you're going to get tired of winning. You're going to say, Mr. President, it's too much. Stop. Says, I'm sorry, but we're just going to keep winning. And those are goofy kind of, sort of what we can kind of pin and say, okay, well, here's sort of an exaggeration of this. But I think there is this continuous ratcheting up. Speaking as a conservative, I'll just put it this way. There are multiple years in which the federal government, if we literally shut down every single department and disband the military, we would still run a deficit. And the reason is because our entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, are just so large, that's where most of the funding's going. So just to take that as a single example, it's very rare to have a politician to actually stand up and say something to the effect of, hey, if we're ever going to rein in spending, we're going to have to do something about entitlements. What that, maybe raise taxes. Maybe that's the solution. Maybe cut entitlements. Maybe a mixture between the two. But we don't talk like that. We don't talk like that. Just sort of like, you can actually show me the math, right? We act like the Bernie Sanders approach of, we just ignore that it's going to come from anywhere, and we promise people the moon. And we do this every election cycle, and every election cycle we're continuously disappointed because we don't get all the good things we were promised.
Yeah. So when I was actually just telling my wife today that, now this is kind of related to the budget. I actually miss the early Trump administration because my gas was cheaper, houses were affordable, and all this other stuff. But I'm also at odds because I personally take climate change seriously, and congressional Republicans do not. Trump certainly didn't seem to. And I know a lot of conservatives who kind of view it as it was changing anyway. So, there's nothing to worry about. I'm just curious to get kind of your take on how do you view something as major as climate change as a conservative?
Well, let me say right off, I am not a climatologist. I'm not an expert in these matters. So take this for what, I was talking earlier, maybe some people shouldn't have an opinion on universal health care. Yeah. But I'll give you maybe at least my initial take on it. I think, first of all, there's multiple questions we would have to answer. What do we mean by climate change? What is causing it? Do we actually have the power to reverse it? And if so, what would that actually take? And at each of those levels, I think we could have a reasoned, nuanced debate and discussion. I am to the point that I think climate change is real. I think it is problematic. I don't think that it means the extinction of the species. I don't necessarily trust individuals to know what the actual long-term implications of climate change are. And this obviously is problematic, right? Because it's like, okay, well then what policy do we craft around it? The irony is, in a real sense, conservatism, I think, offers a better solution as a whole. Now, I'm not talking about those that use the conservative label in Congress, as you rightly point out, who don't acknowledge this is even an issue or that we should be doing anything about it. But the worldview of conservatism, say, it has this sense of conserving that which is mine, taking pride in this neighborhood I live in. and in my home, and let's keeping this place fit and how it ought to be. I think that as a whole has a better odds of addressing environmental issues and say a more collectivist response. If we need a sort of a central unit of government trying to dictate this. Now there is nuance and debate in there. There is an area for, say, a federal response to environmental concerns. I don't think that, say, the Green New Deal is the way to go, because I think that's more about collectivism and trying to issue in some sort of I mean, AOC or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez literally says this is not just about the environment. It's sort of all encompassing, because in that sort of progressive, I'll say radical progressive view, the only way you effectively deal with the environment is to also effectively deal with what they believe to be the inequalities in the market. That's not a conservative approach, right? We're not trying to make everyone equal. We're trying to address sort of these, we're trying to address environmental concerns. And so again, I'm not an expert, so I can't get too deep into it, but I guess I would say that much, that as a younger American, I do think that the right, broadly speaking, has missed the mark. I think that climate change is more a concern than you often hear on the right. What we do about it is a little complicated. I don't think it's a collectivist solution, but I am at least open to sort of, I am open to the debate of where government might have a role to play. But I would also say, part of my frustration is I really think conservatives need to recapture the idea that we should be pro-environment. And that's just more of a cultural decision, right? That we need to, in our own lives, pay attention to how our actions in our individual lives could be affecting our environments.
Yeah, the reason that I had asked that question, obviously no one here is a climatologist, but I just wanted to highlight the difference between what conservatism is on the news and what it really is in daily life with just normal people who are conservative. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And I'd love for us as a society to get away from what we know politics to be now, which, like you said before, is just disingenuous, and there's too much money moving around for us to actually get anything done that we're supposed to get done or need to get done. Yeah. And if nothing changes, nothing, you know what I mean? We're not going to make it anywhere.
Yeah. And so we actually just brought him up again, was Taylor from the Conspiracies podcast, which is, it's just branded as a conservative podcast, right, Chris?
He wants to, it is a conservative podcast, but he's a conservative out of California, which is another thing.
That almost doesn't even sound right to say, but it exists. But one thing that I think he may have been closer to the extreme side of the aisle for conservatism. But one thing he brought up was splitting up the biggest states. So California in particular, because that's where he's from, because they have issues with representation. Is this something that has come up on your podcast? This kind of representation issue where urban areas, especially in states like California, really overrule everything else?
Maybe not that specific. I did go back and listen to, I'll say, the first 10 minutes of that particular episode you're talking about. So I'm loosely familiar with his argument that although I don't know that I heard enough of it to have a strong opinion on it. I think maybe my strongest opinion is there are a lot of things that in theory might be a good idea, but I don't know how we bridge the gap of actually getting there. And I don't know how you would ever convince California to do so. That being said, there are other ways in which, I think there are genuine representation issues, and there's a lot of interesting ideas out there. Or ranked choice voting, for instance. I'm not necessarily pro ranked choice voting, but I'm at least open to it. I think it can invite some other problems. One of the, and this sounds a little radical, but one of the ideas that might sort of speak to this idea of breaking up California is, rather than breaking the state up, is just expand the number of members of the House of Representatives we have in the first place.
That was one of his points.
One of his, yes. And that one, while I say it could invite its own problems, I'm not denying that. We need to carefully think through those things. But that could do two things immediately. One, it may make us a more representative country. That, I don't know what the actual ratio is now, but it's an insane margin. The odds of me actually knowing my congressman or having any sort of influence on them is nil. And as someone jokingly said, they don't think that the size of the United States government should be determined by the fire marshal's limitation on how many we could get into the building. And we obviously have the technology to make this possible to where we wouldn't have to have people with boots on the ground. in theory, you could have there are a lot of things that give this idea merit. It would make it more representative. It could decrease gerrymandering, which is a real problem. I fully acknowledge that if you have a state in which you have an explosion of representation, it's harder to gerrymander them because they are necessarily going to be closer to their constituents, and it's harder to just draw the map in so many different regards that you're just essentially always reelecting the same people, which is neither a Democrat or it's neither a conservative or a progressive position. That's just wrong, but it's hard to know how to overcome that. And lastly, it could institute a little bit more ownership within Congress itself. I keep going back to the example of, or is it climate change or universal health care? We're not all experts there. Congressmen themselves are not all experts in all these issues they're asked to decide on. But maybe if I were, say, an expert on climate change and I ran, I might be a part of that committee. And then I'm not necessarily as beholden to, say, the lobbyist or even the professional staff. I might have a little bit more skin in the game. I might have a little bit more knowledge myself rather than just having to listen to these voices, because that's the one issue I'm particularly good at in say, a larger Congress. So it has a lot of things to merit it. And I know he had some other suggestions there. I guess I'm saying that there are some other things I think are maybe more realistic than busting states up. Plus, you have the added problem if California does that, particularly in our environment, other states are going to do it too, or we're going to do everything we can to try to keep this as balanced as possible, because if one party recognizes, hey, this gets us another seat, the other party's not just going to stand still.
Right. And I didn't necessarily agree with the concept. I don't think Grizz did either, but with the concept of breaking the states up, physically creating new borders. It didn't seem workable. No. I think expanding representation, creating some other system that works better would be a better option. But my wife, who is in American history right now in college, I was talking to her about kind of like how the country got to where it is. And it might be too soon to determine if my idea on this is total nonsense, but when the United States was kind of implemented in that window of time where it was being built, I'm not sure what they had in mind for the size of this country, but it certainly doesn't seem like what they put in place scaled well. To go from what they had, which is roughly mostly just the East Coast, to this entire continent, it did not scale well to 2021. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, the comedian Demetri Martin talked about the United States looks like somebody that was told to draw 50 independent states and started with the west side of the map.
Yeah,
because they think they've got all the space in the world, and they get to the northeast and oh crap, and they have to draw these really tiny tiny areas. And I do and I don't agree with what you just said, because it depends on what we mean by it depends on what we expect it to do. And maybe this is part of my conservatism, part of my conservative is not pessimistic, but is very wary of an idea of our perfectibility. Is always looking for trade-offs, not solutions. If we do this over here, how's it going to hurt us over here? And our founding fathers were very adamant that this system of government is difficult to maintain. And so in a certain regard, this has been the most phenomenally successful experiment in self-government humanity has ever witnessed. I'm not at all downplaying the fact that we have problems. And you're right, in 2021, there are a lot of ways in which we're seeing cracks at the seams. But from a historical perspective, it's not as if you roll the clock back 200 years, there were genuine instances prior to the Civil War where it looked like we were going to have secession of the nation, or the nation split apart. I mean, we were, I think one of the ironies is, I believe it was when Thomas Jefferson was elected, there was serious talk, ironically, in the North of seceding from the nation. And it didn't happen. It ended up, we ended up going through the era of good feelings in which there was sort of a one-party control dominant for many decades. But I say that to say that, Jonah Goldberg, the podcaster, makes this point often. What we're doing is not natural. A human being, whether you believe it was by God's design or by evolutionary processes, is naturally made to either live in a monarch or in a hunter-gatherer society. And we're tribalistic by nature. And we don't live in a tribalistic system, right? We're a being that's made to be tribalistic, living in an unnatural system that requires effort and work. Now, maybe there are better ways to do this. I'm completely open to that. But I think for the rest of our lives and the lives of our children and grandchildren, this is always going to be precarious, difficult system to hold together.
That's a fair point. Actually, multiple times on this show, I do like to remind everybody when we're talking about these political issues that it's important to remember that we're still animals.
We're dumb monkeys.
We're just monkeys with light bulbs. But, that sort of thing aside, going forward, what do you think as a conservative is the best thing for this country to kind of get back on track and bring people back together where we can actually compromise and converse again and maybe get something effective done in this country?
Well, multiple things come to mind, and some of them we have already talked about. I mentioned Yuval Levin and his idea of institutions being used for platforms. I think that would be huge if we could get in our head that, hey, I'm a part of this church. I'm a part of this political party. The point of this is not virtue signaling so I can show everyone else, here's what I'm a part of. The point of it is actually to form me as a stronger individual with greater character. That's something we can do whether or not you're the postman or the president, right? We all inhabit these institutions. Another aspect from a political, simply policy standpoint, I would love to see a revitalization of federalism. There's a lot of issues that it's not so much I disagree with my counterparts on the left, it's that I disagree that it needs to be nationalized. If they want to try it where they're at, if they can demonstrate that actually it does work, then we could federalize this. We could try it in various states. We could try it at a local government where things are more responsible, where individuals can take a little bit greater charge of their life. And if you screw it up, it doesn't hurt my state, right? Or if we screw it up, it doesn't hurt yours. And this one size fits all, I think, is killing us. But I think those are probably maybe the biggest things that come to mind is kind of this revitalization. I think there's also a sense in which we as America have kind of, Riz, you were talking earlier about 9/11 being kind of the last thing that brought us together. Although weirdly, you would think COVID could do it also, but I think we're so divisive at this point, it's actually pushed us further apart. I don't have what's that?
I think on that, there's no clear cut, right? I think 9/11, it was, we knew someone attacked us and there was something to go at. With COVID, it was just in the beginning, no one knew what it was, where it was coming from. And it was just, so what are you going to do, right? We're all helpless. We just got to deal with it. Now you have all sorts of theories going out there to come out of the lab and whatnot. And now that it's been around so long, you have people taking sides on it. But I don't think COVID, although it may have had a huge impact, I don't think it was ever going to bring us together the way an attack on the states was.
And you could be right about that. Yeah.
Even January 6th, you'd look at that, but I still think that didn't do it either.
No,
I have to have something massive.
that may have tore us apart even further. And I'm not of the viewpoint. Let me be clear here. I'm not of the viewpoint that what we need is a war.
No, I'm not either.
That what we, and I'm implying that, but I think there is a sense of when you have a war, what it can do is galvanize a sense of this is what it means to be an American.
Absolutely.
And that is lacking too. And there is a sense in which, unfortunately, because we're a pluralistic society, what we're going to have to get comfortable with is being really uncomfortable with other individuals. What it means for red state America might be different than what it means for blue state America. But if we could get to the point that we could say, you know what, red state America is no more the real America than blue state America and vice versa. These are both legitimate expressions of the American character, even as we debate each other and endlessly say the other person's wrong. I think we'd be a lot better off.
That kind of goes back to what I was saying in the beginning, where it's like people right now have forgotten that people can have an opinion. Just what you were saying with the states. So your state is probably lobbied for certain things, whatever it be, whether it be gun control, healthcare, or whatever, towards your side. A lot of the times, whatever it is, whether it's left or right. And if you didn't like it, move to a state that does it differently. And the problem we have nowadays is you take something like Kyle, right? Where in several states, it wouldn't have been legal what he did, but in his state, it was legal. And all of a sudden you have the people who were in blue states saying, what the fuck, and calling for his death or murder or whatever, where everyone in the reds are going, no, that's legal. We have to remember there are different states, there's different laws, there's different people with opinions. People, if you step outside this country, things change. They're not what you're used to. And you have to be willing to adapt to that.
We're getting close to the end here because it's getting late and we're all getting old. But
My bedtime is 2 hours ago.
This might be kind of a divisive question here. I've heard a lot from the Democratic side of the population that they think it would be much better for the country if conservatism and Republicans ceased to exist. Now, as a conservative, what's your take on the concept of the other side ceasing to exist?
Well, I think whether the question is asked about conservative Republican or say liberal Democrat, my first question would be, what do you mean by that? Or do they mean simply QAnon ceases to exist? I might be in favor of that argument. But no, as I said earlier, I think a vibrant culture necessarily has to have aspects of progressive and conservative worldviews mixed in. Now, I think there are healthier expressions of progressivism. The progressivism that, even if it doesn't say it, is more utopic in nature, or trying to create us into some sort of a perfect society, I think is necessarily destructive in the long run. But there are instances, and if what we mean by conservative is we always keep things the same, which is not what I view conservatives have to believe. But if that's what we mean by a conservative impulse, say, not the ideology, not the worldview, but just the impulse, right? It's the get off my lawn, I just want to keep everything the same. We have to have both of those streams of thought. There is, out of necessity, I think, in blue state America, more creativity, more openness to innovation, more comfort with change. And those are good and necessary for vibrancy. I mean, we see that, it's not a coincidence that our bigger cities are more progressive and our more rural areas are more conservative. That's the sort of person that moves to those places. Both of these things are necessary to hold a culture together. And and again, some of this depends on how we're defining it, because there are aspects in which my preference as a strong conservative is that the conservative sentiment would exercise itself politically, would take charge, and that there would be a left representative in government, but they would necessarily be in the minority. That's not the same as me saying I want them to go away, but I don't think we're benefited. I don't think we benefit as a nation from either side dissolving.
I think that that's a fantastic place to leave off. Kind of touched on a lot of topics here that will give a lot of our listeners, especially the Democratic or liberal listeners, something to think about. Kind of a view into what a conservative is actually thinking when they're not completely insane. So, Josh, thanks for being on the show. Where can our listeners go to find out more about you or hear your podcast?
Well, if you're on a podcast platform, Saving Elephants is how you'd find it. If you're Googling Saving Elephants, I compete with people trying to save actual elephants. So try Saving Elephants blog or Saving Elephants Josh, and you could probably find me there.
All right. So check them out. We'll put a link up too, so you guys can, get around all the actual elephants and find Josh. And again, Josh, thanks for being on. It was a great time.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, fuck this shit, Jerry. I'm out.
Oh, shit. Well, guys, we just found out that Grizz is a liberal, so it's just me now. Well, Grizz, I think that it's pretty safe to say that it's pretty much the same as the 80s now. Everything's divided. Nobody wants to talk to each other. It's kind of a mess, very polarized.
Yeah, it is very polarized, and it's people, and it's always kind of been this way, to my knowledge. People are now looking at what side you take politically, if you do pick a side, even if you don't, like people like ourselves that are kind of in the middle as independents. That's your personality. No, it's not. Not at all. You have a personality and you can have a political opinion.
Yeah.
People need to remember that shit.
Yeah, it's actually, what's interesting is the political climate now is very analogous to the 80s. And there's actually a British skit. I can't remember who the guy was. Connolly, maybe. But he was doing a skit about, like, it was just a satire of the times. And he was listing off your allowable enemies if you were in one side or the other. So he was basically saying, if you're a Democrat, here's your list of enemies that you're allowed to have. And, it was conservatives, warmongers, all kinds of crazy shit. But then the last one was moderates. Then he went to the other side, says, if you're a Republican, here's your list of allowable enemies. And they also ended with moderates.
Yeah. But what's interesting is like, if you go on the Republican side right now, it's like we had talked off air where it was like, if you say anything even moderately liberal, it's you're a socialist. And it's like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Are we back in the 60s and we're fighting communism again? Like, why are we afraid of communism? Like, I'm not saying we should be communists, but why are we afraid of communism? Like,
because
did we even question this in the 60s?
Yeah,
You know what I mean?
it's interesting because you might look at a lot of democratic or liberal ideas and say, there's no way we could execute that.
Oh, absolutely.
But
that's the problem. Where's the money coming from?
yeah, you can say, how are you going to pay for it? But at the end of the day, a lot of those ideas are not bad. It's not really feasible to implement them the way they want.
Yeah,
but
it's just not
if
realistic.
If you say something like everyone in the United States deserves to have health care, and we should implement something where that can happen and people don't end up poor, most conservatives will shut that down immediately and say that they're not going to pay for anybody. But at the end of their life, they're going to take Social Security.
But at the same time, like I think we discussed in this episode, a lot of states you're already paying for it.
Yeah.
So congratulations, you're paying for it. You might as well get benefit out of it too. So
yeah. So I think healthcare is one of the ones that is an outlier for me personally, because the United States spends more on healthcare than most of the rest of the world. And we have the least amount of coverage for our citizens. And a lot of it's just not even good. Like over the last 10 years, my health insurance has gotten worse every year.
Since we record the outros separate from the main episodes, my wife just had surgery, and the amount of money I had to pay out of pocket for the surgery was ridiculous. And like, if you were living paycheck to paycheck, you couldn't afford that shit.
Yeah.
Like, and we have good health insurance on top of that. So
a lot of people just can't afford it. And because of the way that the economy has gone, I also believe a 2-year degree should be covered, because most businesses are now making a 4-year degree mandatory. If you're going to raise the bar that high across the country, then you should raise the bar that high across the country, not just leave everybody floundering after high school. See, that's a bit liberal of me. I know, but it's actually something.
You're pretty liberal in your thoughts. I don't think we can do this anymore. Socialist, this is it. I'm out.
I might be closer to socialism than you, but I don't know if I could really get on board with that whole train.
I mean, even the schooling thing, man. What's laughable for anyone who's going through college right now, or knows anyone going through college, the amount of courses that they have to take that literally have nothing to do with what their major is or ever will have anything to do with it is ridiculous.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff that's really just a money grab. Even, I don't actually remember what the law was, but Biden was actually part of this, where he passed a law that when you declare bankruptcy, it excludes college debt. So if you have $50,000 in debt and you decide to declare bankruptcy, you get to keep that $50,000 in debt by law now. So that tells me that the colleges are definitely all about money, which makes sense because they're all really, at the end of the day, for profit, even the public colleges. And they are in the politicians' pockets, which for me is problematic, whether you're conservative or not. That's a bad idea.
I mean, I think everyone should be against corruption, and it seems like corruption is on full fucking, like, it is just hard charging right now.
It's a cool thing to do now. In the 80s and 90s, which is when we were kind of developing conscious thought, you and I, Grizz.
That was like yesterday for me.
Yeah, it was. But coming up through that time frame, everyone talked about corruption, but you didn't really see it. Now they report it, like themselves.
Yeah. Well, who was it? Was it Clinton that got rid of the I don't remember what the act was about fair reporting, where it was basically you had to kind of, they still didn't take into consideration both sides, but they were supposed to. We should probably look up what the hell that was. But ever since then, it's just become a dumpster fire.
Yeah, we can dive into that more in detail in the future, because I actually, you guys let us know if you want to hear more about this, but I would love to do an episode on, over the last 40 years, the laws that have been put in place that got us where we are, because clearly we're in a mess right now. And a lot of it has to do with policy that got put in place many years ago.
Thank you again for listening to Beautiful Bastards. New episodes every Monday. Remember to like and subscribe. When I kill all humans, you will be spared. Only you. Only you, Joey.
Not everything needs to sound so clever or charming or likable all the time. Sometimes we need to just be able to say things to one another. We need to hear things.